to run would be against God's law. Those are the words of Eric Liddell, as we've just seen in that clip from the famous film Chariots of Fire. It's a great film about the Paris Olympics in 1924. And in that clip we've just watched, Eric Liddell, the sprinter, the 100-meter sprinter, he's just found out that the heats for the 100 meters are going to be on a Sunday, what he calls the Sabbath. And very famously, because it's on the Sabbath, he decides not to run. He transfers to the 400 meters and wins gold as a result. And I start with that clip because it sums up how Christians, certainly over the last couple of centuries in this country, have viewed the Sabbath, Sunday. Attitudes are changing now, but certainly any British Christian who's old enough to have seen that film when it came out at the cinemas will have been shaped by this view of the Sabbath. Sabbath's not a day for playing football, is it, son? It's a powerful film. As I watch it even now, just a few seconds of that Vangelis theme tune brings a lump to my throat. Powerful for us this morning, because one of its central themes in the film is the Sabbath. The two main characters, one of them, as I've said, is Eric Liddell. He's a Christian who observes his Sabbath on a Sunday. And then alongside Eric Liddell is a non-observant Jew, Harold Abrahams, who doesn't seem to be bothered by the Sabbath at all. Raises the question, doesn't it? What do we think about the Sabbath? See, this series is all about work, but we can't think about work as long as we also think about rest. Now, we've got a lot to do this morning. I've basically, in this short time, I've got to give you a whole biblical overview of what the Sabbath means, and I've also then got to apply it. So I've got to be pretty snappy. And therefore, again, we're going to tackle it in two parts. First of all, I'm going to try in this bit of the talk to sum up all that the Old and New Testament says about the Sabbath. And then we'll come back to part two, where it apply it to our lives. So, what is the Sabbath? Well, that question is really pretty simple. It's there clearly defined in our Bible reading in Deuteronomy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. So the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, what we would call Saturday. The Sabbath is Saturday. And the Israelites were commanded not to work on it. That's it. Keeping the Sabbath just means not working for 1 day a week. That's it. And it's really important today that we stick with this modest definition. And I say that because Christians, as we saw in the film, strongly tend to associate the Sabbath with going to church. But please notice here in the Ten Commandments, there is no reference at all to corporate worship. In the Old Testament, keeping the Sabbath is just about rest. It's got nothing to do with going to church. Now, I don't have time to convince you about this morning, but it's so important that I urge you, if you're not convinced, if you're thinking, hold on, I don't get that, please, maybe this afternoon, you read through your Bible until you're convinced. This is really what the Bible says. See, by the time we get to Jesus, after the exile, yes, there was a custom of going to the synagogue every Sabbath. But that link is not here in the original commands about the Sabbath. For example, I could go to all sorts of parts of the Old Testament. Let's just take one. For example, there are 150 Psalms, all of them about Sabbath worship. All of them about worship of the Lord. But only one of them has the title, a Sabbath Psalm. Only one. That is Psalm 92. Now that seems odd, doesn't it? If the Israelites were supposed to worship God corporately 52 Sabbaths of the year, you'd think there'd be more than one psalm out of 150. And even that psalm, if you read Psalm 92, most of the psalm is in the first person. It's I, the psalmist, talking to God. In other words, it's quite likely that the psalm was originally written to be used by individuals and by families as they celebrated the Sabbath at home on their own, in their homes. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Of course, the New Testament does command us to meet regularly together as a church. The early church started to meet on a Sunday because that was the day of the week that Jesus rose spectacularly from the dead. However, there is no evidence in the New Testament either that they thought that they were observing the Sabbath when they went to church on a Sunday. Now, of course, it's quite possible. You may want to mark your Sabbath on a Sunday. There's nothing wrong with that. It's quite possible to go to church every Sunday. My point is that in the Bible, these are two separate and distinct commands. The Sabbath is a day of rest, primarily. We observe the Sabbath by not working one day a week. Now, what else do we see in the Bible about the Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath we see looks in three different directions. First of all, the Sabbath looks backwards to creation. We just read the Ten Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy, but that is the second time that Moses gave the people the Ten Commandments. If you remember, when he came down the first time from Mount Sinai, he found the Israelites worshipping a golden calf, and he was so annoyed, he smashed them. So Deuteronomy chapter 5 is actually the Ten Commandments 2.0. But therefore, it's quite interesting to notice the subtle differences between the first time the Ten Commandments are recorded and the second time. So if we go back to the first time, to Exodus 20, we read the first account of the Ten Commandments. And listen in Exodus 20, this is verse 11, listen to the reason given there for the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In other words, can you see, the Sabbath is supposed to look back to creation. We rest one day a week because God did that when he made the world in the first place. Sabbath rest is built into creation. And that means that the Sabbath commandment is not just a moral rule. It's not like do not murder. It is more like a natural law, like gravity. And therefore it makes no difference what religion you follow, or indeed if you believe in God at all. Sabbath is a gift to all humanity. If you ignore the Sabbath law, you're going to hurt. Just like someone who sort of steps off a 10-story building shouting out, "I can fly," it's going to be the same kind of pain, because Sabbath is like gravity. It's a natural law. But then when we turn back to the passage we've just read in Deuteronomy 5, we see that although the Sabbath command is the same, it's the same commandment, the foundational reason for the Sabbath in Deuteronomy 5 is different. Look at verse 15 of Deuteronomy 5. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So not only is the Sabbath looking back to creation, the Sabbath is also, secondly, looking back to redemption from Egypt. And that's important because although the Sabbath is, yes, generally given as a gift to all of humanity, it is especially given to people who have been redeemed. In other words, the Sabbath is not a rule that we keep in order to be redeemed by God. It's the other way around. God saves us and he gives to his saved people the gift of Sabbath. Now, of course, that's what the Pharisees couldn't see in Jesus' day. They argued about the Sabbath so much because they were viewing it like a rule you had to keep in order to get into the kingdom of heaven, instead of the blessing, the gift that it is to those who were already in his kingdom. Unfortunately, whether intended or not, I don't know, that is somewhat the impression you get from that film, Chariots of Fire, as well. But no, as Jesus put it, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is God's grace. It is a gift to us. So the Sabbath looks back to creation. It also looks back to redemption from slavery. But thirdly, the New Testament teaches us that the Sabbath also looks forward to heaven. Later on, we'll see how Hebrews chapter 4 points forward to Jesus. We only find true rest in Jesus because Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, so that's 3 things about directions, but 3 more things to notice about the Sabbath from Deuteronomy 5. Number 1, the Sabbath is a command from God. I may be saying something that sounds obvious to you, but it is one of the 10 commandments. Now, a lot of the food laws and civil commandments of the Torah don't apply to Christians today, but we never say that about the 10 commandments, do we? The first 3 are all about worshipping God. They all still apply. The last 6 are about how we treat our neighbor. They all still apply. Why shouldn't the Sabbath still apply? Don't Christians need to rest anymore? Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord God has commanded you. It's the first thing. The Sabbath is a command from God. Secondly, the Sabbath sets us apart as different. That comes from verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And you make something holy by setting it apart. The Israelites were to mark the Sabbath in a way that set them apart as different from the surrounding nations. It was the sign to the Lord and to the world that those in this quiet and tranquil household belonged to him, and they were celebrating his care of them. And therefore the Sabbath is not just a blessing of rest, it also has this outward focus too. And then we see the Sabbath is for everyone. Not just other nations, but everyone within society. Our egalitarian eyes miss, I think, just how revolutionary verse 14 is. The Sabbath day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Everybody rests on the Sabbath. Everyone. Even slaves, even animals. See, the Sabbath principle of ancient Israel is in a large measure the root of what has been a huge social revolution in human history. See, the ancient world was very clear in its distribution between work and leisure. Work was for slaves and women, it was said. Leisure was the substance of a man's life, especially a free man's life. So can you see how revolutionary this commandment is? Instead of determining rest by status, it's entirely determined by time. Everybody, even animals, get 1 day off a week. Even the land we see in the rest of the Torah was entitled to Sabbath rest. So at a very simple level, the seventh-day Sabbath served like a humanitarian agenda too, offering Israelite workers an opportunity to catch their breath, to be refreshed for the work required in the week ahead. To be human is to work, and as we've seen, that is a good thing. Work is not a consequence of sin. However, the exhaustion that comes from work is a penalty that we pay for our rebellion. This happens not just because the body is itself subject to fatigue, not just because pain exists in a fallen world, but also because the environment we're charged to care for resists and fights against our care. We saw that in Genesis 3. So to stop working fundamentally is to trust God. And the Sabbath helps us to trust God. Let's express our trust in God as we sing together now the 23rd Psalm. So big thanks to Shalina. So a big thank you to Annika for reading Hebrews 4 for us. As we're now going to put this all together. So really quick overview of the Bible and rest. But here are now 6 simple images to help us apply the Sabbath to our lives today. And the first thing we need to do is stop That's what the Hebrew word Shabbat means. It means literally to stop, to cease from working. Therefore, all of us, if you're a Christian, you need to decide, because it's for your good, to take one day off a week to rest. Stop. Cease work. Now, that could be a Sunday, but it doesn't have to be. Karen and myself, we both have Wednesdays as a day off. Obviously, Sabbath can't be Sunday can't be my Sabbath. And so I'm not sure if the Chariots of Fire film, whether intentionally or not, I'm not sure if it really helps in that regard. You hear the voice being remembered in his head on the ship. Earlier on in the film, you see him on a Sunday telling a boy off for playing football on a Sunday. But the clue there is playing, the word playing, isn't it? Back then on that Sunday, the boy was not working, he was playing. The problem wasn't that he was playing football, that's rest and enjoyment. The problem was he was missing church. That's the issue. So Sabbath is just one day a week without work. But notice the commandment is 6 days a week we work, one day we rest. So that means any work, not just paid work. Now, I realize, of course, on your day off, you've got to do some household chores. We've got to eat. There's certain things you have to do. But I'm talking about the way that so many of us work 6 days a week, sort of paid employment. We work 6 days a week, and we just hoard everything up, and we keep it all up to our day off. And we say, that day I'm going to do everything. So my day off becomes the day where you've got to cut the grass, do the shopping, the ironing, fix the fence, whatever it is. Everything has to be done on that day. That's not rest, is it? It's fine to potter around, of course, do little odd jobs. But the Sabbath means stop. It means rest. Take the day off. But John, you're thinking, but John, if I did that, if I really rested for a day, how would all these other things get done? Precisely. At last, you've got it. That's what the Sabbath is all about. Sabbath means I trust you, God, that if I have a day off, everything will be fine. The Sabbath teaches us how to say no to things. Have you noticed as a society how bad we're becoming at saying no? Whenever events and priorities clash, our society, our instinctive reaction these days seems to be, well, I will just juggle it around. I will find some way to keep everything happy and do everything, even at church. It's because of that dreaded FOMO, isn't it? FOMO, fear of missing out. And so in families, we'll find a way. The kids will go to all their music lessons, all their sporting matches, all their extra tuition. We will go to all our work appointments, all our social things. We will cram everything in and we'll keep everyone happy, even if I need a TARDIS to do it. Well, the Sabbath is a discipline that teaches us to say no, stop. Sometimes it's okay to say no to something simply because your diary is full. Even if that thing is a really good thing, even if that is an important thing. No guilt trips. Shock horror, just this week, I've turned down going to a prayer meeting because it's on a Wednesday. Prayer meeting. How can you turn down a prayer meeting for any reason, surely? But we learn to say no through the Sabbath. Building that regular rhythm of saying, no, actually, it's my day off. That's my day off. I don't do things on my day off. Stop. But the next image is that of airplane mode. As a family, when we used to live in Australia, we would save up our money so that every 2 years we could go back home to visit our family here in the UK. And that meant pretty much 24 hours in the air. Now, as you can see, I'm a pretty big bloke. Squeezing this body into an economy seat for 24 hours is not fun. I find it really hard to sleep on a plane. And yet, despite that, I used to really look forward to those flights. Because back then, it's changing a bit now, but back then it was impossible to receive emails and calls and texts on a plane. And therefore, when you switched all your devices to airplane mode, it really meant that. It meant for 24 hours, I could have no contact with the outside world, and I loved it. It was like one big decompression chamber between two countries, two continents. As I flew from Oz to the UK, I had one day to sort of get work out of my system and to reorientate myself to meet my family again. Now, a significant body of research suggests that even thinking about work is stressful. It's anxiety-inducing. So the problem is when we think about work, it becomes work in and of itself. But when we keep a Sabbath, it changes the way we think. Got to say, if I'm honest, this is one of my biggest mistakes. I so often find myself checking emails and messages on my day off. You know, and it's easy to justify that to my wife and to myself. I say, well, I don't want any surprises. It's good to sort of get ready to know what's coming tomorrow, and that's true. But I need to trust God. I need to trust God that the church is not going to fall apart if I just don't do anything for a day. I am not the Messiah. I'm just a naughty boy. And even more so under lockdown, we need that regular break. And the Sabbath means for one day a week, putting your life on airplane mode. Then thirdly, the Sabbath gives creation time to breathe. We get to breathe, but as we've seen, animals and even the land itself gets to breathe as well. When you journey through the Old Testament and examine in particular the land laws, for example, if you've got time, you want to read through Leviticus 26, it's really interesting to see what God says about Sabbath and the land. Strong connection about God's people keeping the Sabbath and the well-being of the land. But sadly, the Israelites failed. They didn't keep the Sabbath, and they were sent off into exile as a result. And with all those Sabbath laws from the Old Testament, it's interesting to think about what happened to the land during exile. For example, listen to these powerful words. This is from 2 Chronicles 36, explaining what happened during exile. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So when the Israelites were exiled, we read that the land got what it needed, Sabbath rest. The implication, of course, was that the Israelites had not given the land a Sabbath rest. They had stolen from the land. By nothing wrong with working the land, but they'd not allowed it any breaks, any rest. And because they had never ceased, the land could never cease. And so because of their workaholism, Israel was sent into exile. So maybe, if you care for the environment, maybe one of the most positive things you could do for the impact of the health of the planet is to begin to take a Sabbath. If we work 6 days a week, then just think, even one day a week, we are reducing our carbon footprint by a 1/7. And if you think I'm exaggerating by the impact we could make by taking a Sabbath, just think about what we've seen physically during lockdown. I'm sure you saw it too. Within weeks of lockdown, you could physically see the quality of the air improving. You could see wildlife returning to different areas. That's what happens when we rest. The world rests too. And as we rest, so we're renewed, we are healed, and we're prepared to go back to work and breathe. And then the next image is the Addams Family. We will never be able to put the Sabbath into practice until we're willing to stand out as a little bit weird to the rest of the world. I'm sure you remember the Addams Family. They're all together ooky. Their house is a museum where people come to see them. They really are a scream. The Addams Family. See, if you're going to start saying no to things, Some people will think you've gone mad, that you've joined some kind of cult, that you are the Addams family now. But that is part of what it means to keep the Sabbath holy. Doesn't mean that you have to go to church necessarily or pray or read the Bible. It means simply by setting apart a day of rest, you are supposed to be different to the outside world. I wonder, is one of the reasons why so people ask us to give the reason for the hope within us, do they not ask that question because they don't see us as any different? Maybe it's because we don't want to look like the Addams family and we spend all our time in trying to look like all the other families. And maybe that's why Eric Liddell in history stands out as so different, because of his courage, because he was not afraid to be different. But as well as being different, the Addams family is always welcoming to outsiders as well. Okay, I'm stretching the analogy a bit, but bear with me. My point is that when we set a day off apart as a Sabbath rest, that's not a selfish thing, because the Sabbath is always others-centered. I remember years ago when I was a teacher, this must have been about 30 years ago, a friend of mine who was a Christian, he just got engaged, and he announced to several other friends who are Christians that he just read in the Old Testament that one of the laws was that when a young man got married, he didn't have to go off to fight in war for 1 year. And as a result of that, he had decided he was going to come off all rotas at church, and basically he was going to do nothing for a year apart from his job and spend time with his wife. And I vividly remember saying to him that maybe the direct application of that passage was just that he shouldn't go to war for a year. And that's because Sabbath laws are outward focused. For example, in Luke 14, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, in Luke 14, Jesus is invited to eat a meal at the house of a prominent Pharisee with lots of other guests. Now think about that for a moment. Throughout the whole of human history, there has never been a group of people more Sabbatarian, more obsessed with keeping the Sabbath than the Pharisees. And yet even the Pharisees saw the Sabbath as a day of celebration, a day where you invited lots of people to your house for a big party. Even they saw that as it. So when I say the Addams family, I don't mean an excuse. I don't mean rest as some kind of excuse to sort of devote 24 hours to me time or an exclusive family loving. No, the Sabbath is something that draws others into our celebration. In fact, meal times especially in the New Testament are a time to welcome others, single people, others, outsiders into your family. So that's number 4, Addams family. Number 5, we see that Sabbath is for worship. Only it's probably not worship as you're thinking now. It's not worship that's got anything to do with raising your hands or singing songs. What the Bible tells us is that we worship God by simply not working. See, fundamentally, the Sabbath is a heart thing. It's not about following lots of rules and regulations. It's about trusting God. This morning, we've sung lots of songs about trusting God, but it's easy to sing when the words are on the screen. What about living in a way that actually demonstrates that we trust God? As human beings, we are so quick to assume that we have all the answers to our own problems and we have all the answers to all the world's problems. But the gospel says Jesus is the only answer to all our problems. And so true worship happens when we demonstrate that, when we say, we trust you. We're going to do nothing for a day. Now, the Israelites had to trust God that if they took a Sabbath, there would be enough food for them to eat on a Sunday. We have to trust God that if we take a day off, the wheels won't come off everything else. Sabbath declares that God's work is not ultimately dependent on our work, and that God's rest is always more effective than human work. That's what I mean when I say Sabbath is worship. But sixth one, last point. Most of all, the Sabbath is a taste of heaven. I know that Philadelphia cream cheese thinks it's a taste of heaven, but Hebrews 4 tells us otherwise. Taking a day off is also a way of looking forwards, of reminding yourself as a Christian, if you are a Christian this morning, reminding yourself that this world is not your home, but your heart longs to be with Christ in the new heaven and the new earth. Rest is the prevailing image of heaven throughout the New Testament. Because although work is good, there is something about work that makes us restless, makes us hungry for more. As Bruce Springsteen sang, everybody has a hungry heart. Or as Augustine of Hippo put it more pointedly in the 4th century, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So the Sabbath reorientates our heart towards heaven. It builds that kind of natural rhythm into our lives that we don't have all the things, we don't have all the solutions. Actually, every day of the week we're trusting God, and the Sabbath day helps us to see that. And that we will never experience complete rest until we rest perfectly in Jesus. We do not see work as it should be, but we do see Jesus. And it's that rest that our hearts long for. So God rested on the 7th day. Jesus rested on the Sabbath. Why don't we? Our final hymn is Take My Life. It's a hymn all about trusting in God in all our areas of our lives. And we've seen that's what the Sabbath is. Take my life every day. Let's sing. Thanks, Peter.